everyone, it's Taylorverse, and welcome back to the Serial Killer Files. But first, as you can see, I have a pretty nose ring in. It is one of my favorites now. And now that you've seen that, we're gonna take that fucker away. Anyway, you can also get a pretty nose ring or any other kind of body jewelry at bodycandy.com and use code TaylorCurtis25 to get 25% off at checkout. Add over. Back to the book. Alright. Get rid of this motherfucking bookmark. Who they are. Apart from the obvious characteristics, sick minds, twisted desires, a compulsion to kill again and again, it's hard to generalize about serial killers. According to writer Stephen Michaud, the only safe thing you can say about them is that an inexplicably large percentage are named Wayne or Ricky Lee. What? Michaud, one assumes, is at least half joking, actually. There don't seem to be that many Ricky Lees among the world's serial killers. But his larger point is well taken. There are so many exceptions to every rule that talking about the typical traits of serial killers is surprisingly tricky. For example, it's usually said that most serial killers are white. That's certainly true in the US, where the majority of the population is Caucasian. But it's clearly not the case in, say, South America, which is a startlingly high number of serial killers, almost all of them black. Even in our own country, there have been plenty of African-American serial killers. It's also part of the received wisdom of criminology that serial killers are almost always male. Again, that's true, but only if you define serial murder as a very specific type of crime, namely savage violence, sexual homicide of the kind epitomized by Jack the Ripper. That particular brand of mutilation sex murder is in fact only perpetrated by men. As culture critic Camille Paglia puts it, there are no female Jack the Rippers. But under the broader definition formulated by the FBI National Institutes of Justice, a considerable number of females qualify as serial killers. Still, if we limit ourselves to the U.S., and to those psychopathic sex killers first associated with the term serial murder back in the 1970s and 1980s, Gacy, Bundy, Kemper, Ramirez, and the rest of the unholy crew, there are certain general statements that hold true. Damn it, bookmark motherfucker. Hi, Kitty. The sort of serial killer most people think of when they hear that term is a white male between the ages of 25 and 35. He is not psychotic, but rather psychopathic, suffering from what is referred to nowadays as antisocial personality disorder. No. I was thinking, wait, I was diagnosed with something like that. But it wasn't that. It was just close. He is most probably an extreme loner, a socially maladjusted misfit with few, if any, meaningful relationships. Cut off from the world of normal human connections, he indulges in particularly vivid, high, perverse fantasies of torture, domination, and murder. At some point, he crosses a line and acts... Bitch, fuck off. Fuck off. Oh, shit. Acts out these fantasies on actual victims. Depending on his sexual orientation, that is to say, whether he is a gay or heterosexual serial killer, his victims will either be male or female. Though profoundly disturbed in his emotional and psychological makeup, he is not intellectually deficient. On the contrary, he has an above-average intelligence, combined with a criminal cunning that allows him to escape detection long enough to perpetrate a series of atrocities. 10 traits of serial killers. At the 10th triennial meeting of the International Association of Forensic Sciences, held at Oxford, England, in September 1984, Robert Ressler and John Douglas of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, along with Professors Ann W. Burgess and Ralph D'Agostino, delivered a seminal paper on serial murder, based on a study of 36 jailed offenders, including Edmund Kemper and Herbert Mullen. In their presentation, they listed the following traits as the general characteristics of these killers. 1. Most are single white males. 2. They tend to be smart, with a mean IQ of bright normal. 3. Despite their intelligence, they do poorly in school, have spotty employment records, and generally end up as unskilled workers. 4. They come from deeply troubled families. Typical, they have been abandoned at an early age by their fathers and grow up in broken homes dominated by their mothers. 5. There is a long history of psychiatric problems, criminal behavior, and alcoholism in their families. Shit. Go back. Oh, wait, let me... Haha. 6. As children, they suffer significant abuse, sometimes psychological, sometimes physical, often sexual. Such brutal mistreatment instills them with profound feelings of humiliation and helplessness. 7. Because of their resentment toward their distant, absent, or abusive fathers, they have a great deal of trouble with male authority figures. Because they were dominated by their mothers, they have a powerful hostility towards women. 8. They manifest psychiatric problems at an early age and often spend time in institutions as children. 9. Because of their extreme social isolation and general hatred of the world and everyone in it, including themselves, they often feel suicidal as teenagers. Oof, kitty, damn it. 10. They display a precocious and abiding interest in deviant sexuality, and are obsessed with fetishism, voyeurism, and violent pornography. It is important to remember, however, that these traits were extrapolated from a small sample of 36 sadistic lust murderers, all men and most of them white. There are many other serial killers who possess different characteristics. Case study: Edmund Kemper, epitome of evil. A psychopathic killer who embodies most of the traits in the FBI's pioneering paper on serial murder, and indeed who served as one of the interview subjects for that famous study, is Edmund Kemper III, aka the Co-Ed Killer. Kemper's upbringing in a broken home was a nightmare of unrelenting emotional abuse. A hulking boy who grew up to be a 6'9", 300-pound behemoth. He was the target of unremitting ridicule from his mother. She constantly belittled both his physical appearance and weirdo personality. Growing up in the toxic atmosphere of rejection and humiliation, he developed an intense sense of self-loathing, along with an equally virulent hatred of his hectoring mother, which would eventually be projected onto all of womanhood. He began to show signs of extreme psychological disturbance in grade school. While other boys played at being Superman or David Crockett, little Edmund pretended he was being executed in the gas chamber. Once, when someone found out about his crush on his second-grade teacher and teasingly asked why he didn't kiss her, Edmund replied, "If I kiss her, I'd have to kill her first," an early expression of his growing belief that the only women he could count on not to reject him were dead ones. As is common with serial killers, Kemper's sadism manifested itself at a shockingly early age. At first, he contented himself with dismembering his sister's dolls. Before long, however, he was torturing house pets. He decapitated one family cat with a machete and buried another alive. By his early teens, he would indulge in masturbatory reveries of slaughtering everyone in town and having sex with their corpses. In the winter of 1963, the 15-year-old Kemper was shipped off to live with his paternal grandparents on their ranch in Norfolk, California. In the following August, while his grandpa Maud sat in the kitchen table, Edmund shot her in the head with a .22 rifle before stabbing her repeatedly and dragging her corpse into her bedroom. When his grandfather returned from running errands a short time later, Edmund shot him to death as he walked through the door. He then notified his mother and sat down to wait for the police. When questioned about his motives, Kemper shrugged. "I just wondered how it would feel to shoot Grandma." The murder of his grandpa was, he said, an act of mercy, a way to spare the old man of the pain of discovering what had happened to his wife. Diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, Kemper was not yet 16, was committed to Atascadero State Hospital, where he appears to have spent much of his time raptly listening to the fond reminiscence of the various serial rapists he met on his ward. His fantasies became even more dominated by scenarios of sexual violence. Concealing his seething inner life from his therapist, he assumed a mask of docility and newfound religious conviction, and was paroled after only 5 years. In a stunning display of institutional obtuseness, the parole board, against the express advice of Kemper's doctors and his own wishes, discharged him into the care of his mother. Kemper received no counseling or psychiatric treatment of any kind after his discharge. In September 1972, he was examined by a panel and state psychiatrists appointed to determine his mental state. Satisfied with his responses, they deemed him fully rehabilitated and sealed his juvenile record. Following the interview, Kemper headed for the Santa Cruz Mountains in his car. Inside his trunk was the head of a 15-year-old hitchhiker he had killed, raped, and dismembered the day before. Her name was Aiko Ku, and she was the third victim of the rehabilitated Kemper. The first two were 18-year-old roommates from Fresno State College, Marianne Pesk and Anita Lucheska. Kemper had picked them up the preceding May, driven them to a secluded stretch of road, stabbed them to death, and stuffed their bodies in his trunk and drove them home. Smuggling the corpses into his bedroom, he amused himself with his trophies, snapping Polaroid photos, dissecting the bodies, having sex with the viscera. Eventually, he bagged the remains and disposed of them, burying their bodies in the mountains and tossing their heads into a ravine. 6 young women would meet the same fate. Living out the necrophiliac fantasies he had entertained since childhood, Kemper took particular pleasure in raping the corpses, and especially in sodomizing the decapitated heads. On at least 2 occasions he indulged in cannibalism, slicing flesh from the legs of his victims and consuming it in a macaroni casserole. He also kept teeth, hair, and patches of skin as grisly trophies. Psychiatrists would later speculate that all of these poor women were surrogates for the real object of Kemper's hatred, his mother. That his frenzy climaxed with the horrendous act of matricide tends to confirm this theory. On the day before Easter 1973, Kemper crept into his mother's bedroom at sunrise with a knife and hammer. He smashed in her skull, slit her throat, cut off her head, and raped her decapitated corpse. In one of the more symbolically resonant acts of the annals of criminal depravity, he jammed her larynx down the garbage disposal, which promptly spat it back out into his face. That seemed appropriate, Kemper would later tell the police, as much as she'd bitched and screamed and yelled at me over the years. He also propped her head on the mantel and used it as a dartboard. Later that day, he invited her best friend over for dinner. When she arrived, he strangled her with a scarf, took her corpse to bed, and spent the night molesting the body. The following morning, Easter Sunday, he fled eastward, driving nonstop to Pueblo, Colorado, where, realizing he had nowhere to run, he put in a call to the police back home. At first, no one at the precinct believed his confession. As is common with serial killers, Kemper was a police buff who had befriended many members of the Santa Cruz Department. Eventually, however, he persuaded them, then patiently waited at the phone booth for the authorities to arrive and place him under arrest. He offered a full and sickeningly detailed confession. As tried, he was judged to be legally sane and convicted of 8 counts of murder. When the judge asked him what punishment he felt was suitable for his crimes, Kemper replied, not unreasonably, death by torture. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he remains as of this writing. Warning signs. Hold up, I'm curious of something. 281. Oh, good God. Okay. Nope. Okay, psychoanalysis is based on the belief that you can explain an adult's troubled behavior by tracing the causes back to his childhood experiences. But as Freud himself admitted, it is impossible to do the opposite, i.e., look at a young child's experiences and predict exactly how he'll behave as a grown-up. This certainly holds true in the case of serial killers. If you look at the life of, say, Peter Kürten, who grew up in a household where incest was rife and who was tortured from an early age in the joys of animal torture and bestiality, it seems inevitable that he ended up becoming a sadistic lust murderer. On the other hand, if you take a different child who had been subjected to a disturbed, even degenerate upbringing, you can't say for sure that he will turn out to be a homicidal psychopath. Still, in attempting to locate the root causes of serial murder, researchers have identified 3 major warning signs that are often found in the backgrounds of these criminals. These 3 behavioral red flags, often referred to as the psychopathological triad, are inersis, bedwetting, pyromania, fire starting, and precocious sadism, generally in the form of animal torture. 1. Bedwetting. There's nothing unusual or alarming about bedwetting in itself. It is a common phenomenon among little children. When the problem persists into puberty, however, it may well be a sign of significant and even dangerous emotional disturbance. According to the findings of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, fully 60% of sex murderers were still suffering from this condition as adolescents, like the African-American serial killer Alton Coleman, who wet his pants so often he was saddled with the taunting nickname Pissy. Fire starting. Given their lust for destruction, it's no surprise that among their other twisted pleasures, many serial killers love to set fires, a practice they often begin at an early age. Some of the most notorious serial killers of modern times were juvenile arsonists. Otis Toole, for example, Henry Lee Lucas, Loathsome's accomplice, began torching vacant houses when he was 6 years old. Carl Panzram, arguably the most unrepentant killer in the annals of American crime, took positive pride in the havoc he could wreak with a matchstick, boasting in his jailhouse memoirs that at the tender age of 12 he caused $100,000 worth of damage by burning down a building at reform school. Carlton Gary firebombed a grocery store while in his teens, and David Berkowitz, who ultimately confessed to more than 1,400 acts of arson, was so obsessed with fires as a little boy that his schoolmates nicknamed him Pyro. Firebombing stores and incinerating buildings is, of course, an intensely pathological expression of anger and aggression, but it's more than sheer malice that underlies the incendiary crimes of serial killers. According to specialists in the psychology of perversion, there's always an erotic motive at the root of pyromania. There is but one instinct which generates the impulse to incendiarism, writes Willem Steckel in his classic work on aberrant behavior. That is, the sexual instinct in arson clearly shows its connecting point with sex. True, there are often secondary motives behind a pyromaniac's act. Revenge, for example, like Panzerm's desire to get back at his tormentors. But above all, as Steckel writes, the incendiary is sexually excited by the flames. He likes to watch them burn. Anyone who doubts this has only to read Flora Schreiber's writings about the New Jersey serial killer Joseph Collinger, who was thrown into orgasmic raptures by the mere thought of the fires he had caused. In short, serial murderers who enjoy starting fires do so for the same reason that they love to torture and kill. It turns them on. Oh, fuck off. Oh, what ecstasy setting fires brings to my body. What power I feel at the thought of fire. Oh, what a pleasure, what a heavenly pleasure. I see the flames and no longer is a fire just a daydream. It is the reality of heaven on earth. I love the excitement of the power fire gives me. The mental image is greater than sex. Joseph Collinger. Animal torture, juvenile sadism directed at lower life forms, is nothing new. There have always been children and... Shut up! And adolescents, usually male, who enjoy hurting small creatures. Certainly Shakespeare knew about such things. In King Lear, he writes about wanton boys who pull the wings off of flies for sport. And in Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the hero finds himself in a one-horse town where a bunch of young loafers are amusing themselves by tying a tin pan on the tail of a stray dog and watching him run himself to death. As disturbing as such behavior is, however, it pales beside the kinds of cruelties perpetrated by budding serial killers. As an adolescent, Peter Curtin, who took pleasure from performing intercourse with various animals while simultaneously stabbing them or slitting their throats. At 10, Edmund Kemper buried his family cat alive in the backyard. Afterward, he dug up the carcass, brought it back to his bedroom, cut off its head, and stuck it on a spindle. 3 years later, after his mother brought a new cat into the house, Kemper sliced off the top of its skull with a machete, then held its foreleg while it showered him with blood. Besides collecting roadkill, little Jeffrey Dahmer liked to nail live frogs to trees, cut open goldfish to see how their innards work, and perform impromptu surgery on stray dogs and cats. Dennis Nelson, the so-called British Jeffrey Dahmer, once hanged a cat just to see how long it would take to die. Albert DeSalvo enjoyed trapping house pets in wooden crates and shooting them with a bow and arrow, while Carol Cole, aka the Barfly Strangler, got a kick out of choking the family dog unconscious. Okay, here's the thing about me. I put animal lives far above human lives, so, I don't like any of this part at all. Other violent psychopaths have disemboweled their pets, burned them alive, fed them ground glass, and cut off their paws. According to ASPCA therapist Dr. Stephanie Lafarge, anyone who hurts animals has the potential to move on to people. Of course, most boys who commit minor acts of childhood sadism outgrow such behavior and look back with shame at the time they blew up an anthill with a cherry bomb or dismembered a daddy longlegs. By contrast, the cruelties perpetrated by incipient serial killers grow more extreme over time until they are targeting not stray animals and house pets, but other human beings. For them, animal torture isn't a stage, it's a rehearsal. I found a dog and I cut it open just to see what the insides looked like, and for some reason, I thought it would be a fun prank to stick its head on a stake and set it out in the woods. Jeffrey Dahmer. How smart are serial killers? There's a simple explanation for the fact that so many serial killers have above-average IQs. Generally speaking, it requires a certain degree of intelligence to get away with repeated acts of homicide. There are plenty of sex criminals who have committed atrocious acts of mutilation murder. Fortunately, most of them are so sloppy or stupid that they are caught right away and so never have a chance to become serial offenders. I've seen many murderers who might well have gone on to become serial killers. Criminal psychiatrist Dorothy Otno Lewis testified, if they had the wits not to get arrested. Still, there's a tendency to exaggerate the mental capacities of serial killers, particularly since they are so often portrayed in the media as intellectual prodigies a la Hannibal Lecter, a psychopath so staggeringly erudite that he commits murder to the strain of Mozart and knows Dante by heart in the original Latin. Lecter, however, is a purely mythic creature. He is a reflection not of the way serial killers really are, but how they like to think of themselves. In their pathological narcissism, their profoundly misguided sense of their own superiority, serial killers like to imagine that they are criminal masterminds who can outwit the world. Serial killers with genius-level IQs, however, are almost non-existent. Some, in fact, are profoundly stupid, relying on low criminal cunning rather than brains to elude the law. Otis Toole, for example, Henry Lee Lucas's accomplice, and the psycho believed responsible for the abduction and murder of little Adam Walsh, had an IQ of 75. Others are profoundly psychotic, lost in their own bizarre worlds of paranoid delusion. Even the brightest serial killers are a lot less intelligent than they think. John George Hyde, the infamous British acid bath murderer of the 1940s, was a highly intelligent and cultivated man. For all his sophistication, however, he mistakenly believed that the Latin phrase corpus delicti, the legal term for the body of evidence indicating that a crime had occurred, referred to the actual cadaver of a homicide victim. This erroneous belief that a person could not be indicated for murder if no corpse was found eventually led to his undoing. Ted Bundy was a law student and rising young figure in the Washington State Republican Party. Insisting on serving as his own defense lawyer during his murder trial, he turned the proceedings into a travesty and proved the adage that a man who defends himself has a fool for a client. Gay serial killer Randy Kraft had an IQ of 129 and made big bucks as a computer consultant. Still, he got himself arrested while driving drunk with a strangled corpse on the passenger seat. And when Gary Heidnik, a financial whiz who made a fortune on the stock market, was arrested for keeping chained and tortured sex slaves in the basement of his Philadelphia home, the best defense he could come up with at the time of his arraignment was that the women were already there when he moved into the house. Male and female. In October 2002, Eileen Wuornos, oh my god, this one's my mom's favorite to read about. I know it's weird to, be like, oh, this is my favorite serial killer, because, they're fucked up people and, people died, but you know what I mean. The most interesting to her. So I'm just gonna say favorite. 'Cause fuck. The Florida hooker who shot 7 male motors in the span of a year was executed for her crimes. From the time of her arrest, she was widely touted in the media as America's first female serial killer. Catchy as that label was, it was completely inaccurate. There have been dozens of female serial killers in our country's history. The phrase female serial killer conjures up images of a distaffed Jack the Ripper, a lone woman psychopath, coolly stalking and snaring her victims, then butchering and mutilating them in a sex-crazed frenzy. In fact, there are no women who fit that particular model, at least not outside of overheated Hollywood fantasies like Basic Instinct. I don't know what movie that is. I haven't seen that. Maybe I should see that. Well, police discover a corpse with its throat slit, its torso cut open, its viscera removed, and its genitals excised. They are justified in making one basic assumption. The perpetrator was a man. That doesn't mean that there's no such thing as a female serial killer. It just means that men and women commit serial murder in different ways. The sort of atrocities perpetrated by male serial killers, the kind involving rape, mutilation, dismemberment, seem to be a function of particular masculine traits. More specifically, there are unmistakable parallels between this kind of violence, phallic, aggressive, penetrative, rapacious, and insofar as it commonly gratifies itself upon the bodies of strangers, undiscriminating, and the typical pattern of male sexual behavior. Okay, I'm just gonna say, if I were ever to be a serial killer, I would totally target men and cut their dick off. This don't make sense. Most women would totally cut a man's dick off, because if a woman were to be, pushed so far as to go and kill a bunch of people, it would probably be because men have pissed them off so much, and they would totally cut their dicks off. Totally. Don't even. Women of the world watching this, admit it. If you were pushed so far as to go kill people, it would be the bitches that fucked with you and your man, some random men, and you'd cut all of their dicks off. I'm just saying. This is inaccurate. Talking about how fucking cutting off the genitals is a male characteristic. Hell no. Disclaimer, I'm not saying that I'd ever do this, because I wouldn't. But if I ever did, hypothetically, I'd totally cut their dick off. Not for sexual reasons, but because men value their dick too much. It's their most valued body part. So you chop that bitch off. Anyway. For this reason, it is impossible to see sadistic mutilation murder as a grotesque distortion for pathological intensification, in the words of Dr. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, of normal male sexuality. But if this intensely savage type of serial murder is exclusive to men, a monstrous expression of male sexuality, then what is the equivalent female form? Clearly, it must reflect female sexuality. Generally speaking, female serial killers differ from their male counterparts in roughly the same way that the sexual responses and behavior of women typically differ from those of men. A useful analogy here is pornography. It is a truth universally acknowledged that while men are aroused by extremely raw depictions of abrupt, anonymous, anatomically explicit sex, women in general prefer their pornography to involve at least a suggestion of emotional intimacy and leisurely romance. Whether these differences in taste are a function of biologically or culture is an open question. I know plenty of women that just like explicit sex for porn. I don't watch porn. But if I did, I wouldn't need the romance and shit. That's for movies. If you're watching porn, aren't you just watching it for the sex? Romance is for movies. I don't... Whatever. The indisputable fact is that the differences are real. Okay. I'm gonna disagree with that. Seriously, like, if I were to watch porn, it would be for sex. But I want romance, so I watch movies. I mean, shit. Hi, Kitty. Like, whatever. An analogous distinction holds true for serial killers. Female psychopaths are no less depraved than their male counterparts. As a rule, however, brutal penetration is not what turns them on. Their excitement comes not from violating the bodies of strangers with phallic objects, but from a grotesque, sadistic travesty of intimacy and love. From spooning poisoned medicine into the mouth of a trusting patient, for example, or smothering a sleeping child in its bed. In short, from tenderly turning a friend, family member, or dependent into a corpse, from nurturing them to death. What made Aileen Wuornos unusual was that she was a rare, though by no means unique, example of a woman who killed her victims in an assaultive, phallic style of male serial stalkers like David, son of Sam Berkowitz. So see, I don't know. All I'm saying is, it's 2020. Men and women are equal. Men can poison and smother with a pillow all they want. Well, not legally, but like, you know what I fucking mean, damn it. And women can cut off the dick all they need to. Like, don't generalize the fucking serial killer style because of gender. Like, most women I know would totally chop off a dick before smothering someone. Like, what the fuck? None of the people I know would ever do it, myself included. We're not insane, but hypothetically speaking, fuck. The majority of female serial killers throughout history have relied on poison to dispatch their victims. For most people, there is a quaint arsenic and old lace quality associated with such crimes, as though disposing of a few people by feeding them arsenic-laced oatmeal were a rather genteel form of murder. The truth is that compared to the lingering agonies suffered by the average poisoning victims, the death meted out by male serial killers like Jack the Ripper, son of Sam, or the Boston Strangler, the swift execution by knife blade, bullet, or garrote, seem positively humane. Female poisoners, in other words, differ from the popular stereotype of the dotty old maid getting rid of a burdensome houseguest with a little nip of lethal hot cocoa. Many are terrifying sadists who derive intense perverted pleasure from the sufferings of their victims. There is no doubt that a male serial sex murderer tends to be more lurid, more spectacularly violent than the female variety. Whether it is more evil is another matter. After all, which is worse, to dismember a streetwalker after slitting her throat, or to cuddle in bed with a close friend you've just poisoned to the climax repeatedly as you feel the body beside you subside into death? I think that the whole female poisoner thing is mainly in movies. Like, from what I have seen, like, reading about serial killers, most women do the whole dismemberment shit. This book is talking about how the poisoning is the most common method, but I have mostly seen dismemberment. I don't know. I know I haven't read up on all the bitches, but shit, fuck. But I'd say these people haven't either. I mean, they have a bunch, because they have case studies. But shit. I don't like... I think the point I'm trying to make is I don't like that it's generalizing the genders. And I have a very bad way of trying to say that. Case study. Jane Toppan, the Jolly Psychopath. Like so many other serial killers, Jane Toppan was the product of a severely unstable upbringing. Her name was Honora Kelly. She was born in Boston in 1857, the child of a poor Irish couple. Her mother died when Honora was a baby, leaving her in the dubious care of her father Peter, a chronic drunk prone to violent outbursts and so wildly eccentric that his neighborhood nickname was Kelly the Crack, as in crackpot. In 1863, Kelly, eager to be free of his family burdens, deposited Honora and her older sister Delia in the Boston Female Asylum, an institution for orphan and other desperately needy girls. He never saw his children again. Less than 2 years later, Honora was placed out, signed over to a full-time live-in servant to Miss Abner Toppan, a middle-aged widow from Lowell, Massachusetts. Though never formally adopted, she was given the name Jane Toppan. Her position in this household was always equivocal. On the one hand, she was treated as the member of the family. On the other, she was never allowed to forget her lowly origins of her place as a menial. Within the community, her dark Irish looks branded her as a permanent outsider. After a childhood of abuse, rejection, and abandonment, she grew up in a constant state of humiliation. It was the perfect recipe for making a psychopath. At no point in her life did Jane appear criminally deranged. On the contrary, she struck most acquaintances as a lively, outgoing person. Jolly Jane, they called her. Like others of her ilk, however, she had hidden a self that was hopelessly diseased. She was a lifelong liar and gossip, spreading malicious rumors about people she envied. She was also, like many prospective serial killers, a secret pyromaniac who derived intense erotic pleasure from starting fires. Beneath her amiable exterior existed a poisonous well of malevolence, a deep, implacable longing to do harm. She found the perfect outlet for her dark desires in nursing. Enrolling in the training school of Cambridge Hospital, she impressed many of the doctors with her competence and pleasing personality. Secretly, however, she was experimenting on her patients, administering various poisons to them late at night when no one else was around. I've heard of this bitch. Eventually, she settled on the lethal combination of atropine and morphine as the most satisfactory method. Exactly how many victims she killed during those years is unclear, though the number was at least a dozen. As she later confessed, she became addicted to murder. Making people die gave her a voluptuous delight. Her pleasure was even more intense as she climbed into bed with her victims and held their bodies tight while they suffered their final convulsions. Eventually, she hired herself out as a private nurse. Her professional skill and personal charm made her a favorite among some of the most respectable families in Cambridge. No one knows for certain how many patients died as a result of her care during this 10-year period of her life, though estimates range as high as 100. Among them were her best friend Mira Connors and her foster sister Elizabeth. As with other psychopaths in the grip of a murderous compulsion, her killings escalated in frequency. Her undoing came in the summer of 1901 while vacationing in a Cape Cod cottage owned by an old friend, Alden Davis. Within a 6-week span, Jane murdered Davis, his wife, and his 2 married daughters. The shocking obliteration of the entire family aroused suspicion, and Jane was soon arrested. In custody, she stunned some of Boston's leading psychiatrists by admitting that her murders were motivated by an irresistible sexual impulse. She got a powerful erotic charge from holding her poisoned victims in her arms while they died. This need had grown increasingly powerful over the past year, and during the preceding summer she had let herself go. She was diagnosed as morally insane, the Victorian term for a criminal psychopath, and sentenced to spend the rest of her life in a mental asylum. No sooner had her brief trial ended than she shocked the nation by confessing to 31 murders. She spent the remaining 36 years of her life in a state mental hospital, dying at the age of 84 in 1938. According to legend, she would occasionally beckon to one of the nurses and, with a conspiratorial smile, say, "Get the morphine, dearie, and we'll go out into the world. Ward, you and I will have a lot of fun seeing them die." Angels of Death. Jane Toppan falls into a common category of female serial killer. The psychopathic nurse who, instead of serving as an angel of mercy, acts as an angel of death. The annals of crime are filled with such homicidal healthcare workers. Anna Marie Hahn. Typical of the breed was Anna Marie Hahn, a German immigrant who settled in Cincinnati and took up a career as a live-in nurse, tending strictly to lonely old men with large bank accounts. After getting her hands on their cash, she would dispatch them with various lethal poisons, arsenic spiked beer being a favorite. One prospective victim became suspicious when some houseflies dropped dead after sampling the mug of brew Nurse Hahn had just served him. Between 1932 and 1937, she poisoned an indeterminate number of elderly clients, possibly as many as 15. Arrested in 1937, she was convicted of first-degree murder, and on December 7, 1938, she became the first woman to die in Ohio's electric chair. Janine Jones. A more recent and even more prolific angel of death was Janine Jones. Originally a beautician, she switched to vocational nursing in 1977 to pursue her lifelong dream of caring for critically ill children. Unfortunately, this dream was motivated not by any healthy desire to help others, but by a psychopathic need to prove that she was a miracle worker who could rescue tiny patients from the brink of death. In 1981, after 4 years of work at various hospitals in and around San Antonio, Texas, she accepted a position at the Bexar County Medical Center. Not long afterward, administrators began to notice an alarming increase in the deaths of little patients. An investigation was quickly launched, and suspicion quickly focused on Nurse Jones. Like other compulsive killers who continued to commit their horrors even while under official scrutiny, Nurse Jones kept right on going. Resigning from Bexar in March 1982, she joined the staffs of Kerr County Clinic. Almost immediately, Kerr found itself plagued with a rash of inexplicable medical emergencies involving young children who were seized with violent respiratory attacks while undergoing routine checkups. Once again, the link between these events and Janine Jones was impossible to ignore, particularly when an incriminating bottle of muscle relaxant turned up in her possession. Eventually, a jury took just 3 hours to convict her of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Her motive sprang from the depraved narcissism characteristic of psychopaths. To prove herself a heroine, she would inject her victims with medications that precipitated respiratory failure or cardiac arrest, then rush to their rescue. She did, in fact, manage to save them, but all too often they succumbed. She is, though, thought to be responsible for the death of as many as 46 babies and young children. I've read about this person. These women take great delight in their secret hidden power. In watching the suffering and slow death of their victims, she receives the utmost stimulation. She strives for the will to power which is characteristic of her sadistic nature, and obtains this through the anguish and suffering of her victims. J. Paul DeRiver, The Sexual Criminal. Black Widows. Shit, fuck. Since serial killers seem almost supernaturally evil, they are often given the kinds of lurid nicknames accorded to the comic book supervillains. Just as homicidal nurses are known as Angel of Death, another common type of female psycho killer is known as the Black Widow, named after the poisonous female spider. Female spider? Aren't there male Black Widow spiders? Yeah, there are Black Widow males. Males are lighter in color with red or pink spots on their back. Fucker. I thought so. What does... This little thing keeps coming up in the... in the corner. Oh, I didn't want that. I see. Named after the poisonous female spider that devours its own mate, this criminological category refers to women who murder a whole string of husbands, along with anyone else they perceive as an obstacle to their own happiness, such as burdensome children, interfering in-laws, inconvenient acquaintances, and the like. These are my favorite to read about. These ones are fun. I know, like, murder's not fun, but, like, if you like creepy, dark shit like I do, you understand. I'm not gonna fucking explain myself anymore. In their book, Murder Most Rare, Michael and C.L. Kelleher identify the essential traits that make this kind of serial killer particularly deadly. The Black Widow is typically intelligent, manipulative, highly organized, and patient. She plans her activities with great care. Her crimes are usually carried out over a relatively long period of time, and she is rarely suspected of murder until the victim count has become significant or the number of deaths among her relatives and acquaintances can no longer be considered coincidental. In many cases, the Black Widow begins to murder relatively late in life, often after the age of 30, and therefore brings a good deal of maturity and patience to the planning and commission of her crimes. She relies on her ability to win the confidence and trust of her victims as a precursor to any attack. For this reason, she is seldom viewed as a suspect, even after she has committed several murders. The average Black Widow will claim between 6 and 13 victims during her active period, which generally ranges from 10 to 15 years. Nanny Doss. Hiya, kitty. What's he doing, huh? One of the more notorious Black Widows of the recent times was the pudgy, bespectacled Nanny Doss, dubbed the Giggling Nanny because of her habits of chortling and amusement while discussing her crimes. The product of a harsh and abusive upbringing, Doss was a lifelong addict of true romance magazines, seeking refuge from the unpleasant realities of her existence in sugar-coated fantasies of undying love. Unfortunately, the men she met and married, generally through classified Lonely Hearts ads, were anything but Prince Charmings. Most were philandering alcoholics. When each new mate proved less than ideal, Nanny dispatched him with a generous dose of rat poison, mixed into whiskey or coffee or stewed prunes. Between 1929 and 1953, she murdered 4 husbands. She might have added to that tally if the doctor who treated her final husband hadn't grown sufficiently suspicious to order an autopsy, which turned up enough arsenic in the victim's body to have killed 18 men. Under arrest, she indignantly denied that she murdered for profit, and in fact the money she realized from her husband's savings account and life insurance policies was barely enough to cover their funeral expenses. Her motive, she claimed, was love. I was searching for the perfect mate. The real romance of life, she told interrogators. Of course, that didn't explain why she also poisoned 2 children, grandchild, 2 sisters, and her mother. In 1955, Doss was sentenced to life in prison, where she died of leukemia 10 years after writing her memoirs for Life magazine. My late husband sure did like prunes. I fixed a whole box and he ate them all. Nanny Doss. Mary Besnard. An exact contemporary of the Giggling Nanny was the French Black Widow, Marie Besnard, known in her country as the Queen of Poisoners. Born in 1896 in Loudun, France, she received strict religious training at a local convent, an education that didn't prevent her from acquiring a apparently well-deserved reputation for sexual promiscuity as an adolescent. In 1920, at the age of 23, she wed an older cousin, Auguste Antigny. The marriage ended abruptly 7 years later when her husband died of what the doctors called fluid in the lungs, the first in a long string of medical misdiagnoses that would be made on Marie's murder victims. In 1929, she married her second husband, Leon Besnard. Over the course of the next 20 years, Leon's family would be eliminated one by one in a series of shockingly unexpected deaths that came to be known locally as the Besnard curse. The first to die were 2 great aunts, then Leon's father, mother, sister, 2 spinster cousins, and finally Leon himself. During this time, Marie also knocked off her own father, mother, and an elderly couple she had befriended. Her victims' deaths were attributed to everything from strokes to bizarre accidents. 2 of her victims died, she claimed, when they had mistakenly eaten a bowl of lye, thinking it was a special dessert. That the police accepted such a far-fetched explanation suggests that the investigation into the Besnard curse was led by Inspector Clouseau. I like that name, Clouseau. After the 13th suspicious death, authorities decided to perform an autopsy on Leon Besnard, whose body was found to be full of arsenic. More examinations followed, all with the same result. Arrested in 1950, Marie first confessed, then recanted and hired the best lawyers money could buy. Her legal dream team did its job. She was brought to trial 3 times in 1952, 1954, and 1961. The first 2 proceedings ended in mistrials, the third with her acquittal. In France, her case is considered to be the perfect crime. Deadlier than the male, the female of the species is more deadly than the male, wrote Rudyard Kipling. Anyone who doubts that female psychopaths can be as lethal as any man should consider the following cases. Marie de Brinvilliers, the spoiled, sexually promiscuous daughter of the prominent Persian family. Marie murdered her father, 2 brothers, and as many as 50 other victims with a poison that she secretly tested on unwary patients at the Persian Pauper Hospital. In July 1676, she was publicly beheaded for her crimes in front of the Notre Dame Cathedral. Anne Zensweger, born in Nuremberg. Sorry, I thought of memories. Nuremberg, Germany. I haven't been there. My friend is from, an old friend is from there. Anna grew to be a profoundly unattractive woman and was said to resemble a toad. In her 40s, after a life of hardship and disappointment, including a miserable marriage to an abusive alcoholic that ended when he drank himself to death, she hired herself out as a housemaid to a succession of well-to-do men, hoping that one would become so dependent on her domestic skills that he would marry her. Unfortunately, each of her prospective mates was either already married or engaged. Zensweger attempted to solve this problem by murdering the women with arsenic. She also killed one of her employers for spite and poisoned the food of at least a dozen other people, including an infant whom she gave a teething biscuit dipped in arsenic-laced milk. By the time of her arrest in 1811, the act of poisoning had grown to be an uncontrollable passion. She was beheaded in July of the same year. Her body was then lashed to a wagon wheel and displayed in public. It is perhaps better for the community that I should die, as it would be impossible for me to stop poisoning people. Anne Zensweger at her sentencing. Jazinga Gottfried, a native of Bremen, Germany, the beautiful blonde Jazina was a classic psychopath who experienced supreme ecstasy from watching people die, and was, by her own admission, born without a conscience. During a 10-year span, she poisoned 16 people, including her 3 husbands, her 2 young sons, her parents, a brother, an old friend, and the wife and 5 children of an employer named Rumpf. Arrested in March 1828, after Rumpf grew suspicious, she displayed not the slightest trace of remorse. On the contrary, she boasted of her crimes. I was born without a conscience, she declared, which allowed me to live without fear. Convicted of 6 counts of murder, she was beheaded in 1828. Helen Yegato? We're gonna go with Yagato. During her 30-year career as a domestic servant in villages throughout Brittany, France, Yagato murdered as... Oh god, it's French. I don't remember how that would be pronounced. I was going with Spanish. Ooh. Whatever. Don't care. Murdered as many as 27 people with no motive other than the sheer pleasure of killing. Wielding arsenic as her weapon, she poisoned men, women, and children. Arrested after killing off another servant in the household of a university professor, she staunchly maintained her innocence, denying all responsibility for the long string of corpses she had left in her wake. Wherever she went, she tearfully insisted people just happened to die. The evidence against her, however, was overwhelming. She was guillotined in 1851. Ooh, guillotines are my favorite. Like, everyone's all like, oh, the Iron Maiden, or fucking that thing that pulls your body from all different angles and stretches you until you fucking come apart. No, I like guillotines. Mary Ann Cotton. For this bitch. We talked about this one at school. Which, if you think about it, Okay. I had a very interesting history teacher who taught us many things that were not in the books. Mary Ann Cotton was one of them. One of the most prolific serial killers in English history, Mary murdered an estimated 23 people in a 12-year period. Among her victims were 3 husbands, 10 children, 5 stepchildren, a sister-in-law, and an unwanted suitor. Most of the deaths were attributed to gastric fever, until an autopsy of her 7-year-old stepson revealed enough arsenic in his stomach to have killed 3 men. She was hanged on March 24th, 1873, and quickly immortalized in a popular nursery rhyme. Mary Ann Cotton, she died and she's rotten. She lies in her bed with her eyes wide open. Sing, sing, oh what can I sing? Mary Ann Cotton is tied up with a string. Where, up in the air. Settling black puddin's a penny a pair. 19th century British nursery rhyme. I haven't heard of that. Sarah Jane Robinson. A frighteningly remorseful psychopath who felt no qualms about subjecting her nearest relations to agonizing death. The Irish-born Sarah Jane Tennant immigrated to America after being orphaned at the age of 14. Her lethal career began around 1880, when she poisoned her husband, 3 of her 8 children, including her infant twin sons, and the elderly landlord to whom she owed $50 in back rent. Her homicidal mania reached a pitch during the 18-month period that began in February 1885, when, partly for mercenary reasons, partly out of sheer depravity, she murdered her sister, her brother-in-law, her 1-year-old niece, her 6-year-old nephew, her own 25-year-old daughter, and 23-year-old son. Arrested in August 1886, she became known in the press as America's worst poison fiend. After 1 mistrial, she was condemned to hang, though her sentence was later commuted to life in prison. She spent the remainder of her life in a narrow cell decorated with engraved newspaper portraits of her victims. Oh. Lovely. Marty Enriqueta. This self-styled witch kidnapped, sexually abused, and ritualistically butchered small children in Barcelona. Witch! A witch! Ooh! Interesting! This is one of the bitches that give us bad names. In the early years of the 20th century, she apparently cannibalized her victims, then boiled the leftovers for use as an ingredient in the love potion that she sold to local peasants. She was arrested and executed in 1912 after a young victim, Angelita, who had been forced to eat human flesh while in captivity, escaped from Enriqueta's lair and alerted the police. Julia Fazekas, a midwife in the remote Hungarian village of Negarev Fazeka, not only delivered babies, but also performed illegal abortions and supplied poison to any woman wishing to rid herself of an unwanted husband, troublesome child, aging parent, or wealthy uncle. Oh, sorry, Kitty. I forgot you were there. I just pushed you right aside, didn't I? Damn it. Ordering flypaper in bulk, she would boil off the arsenic coating and render it into powder, which she sold to her clients for $8 to $40 a dose, depending on what they could afford. For 2 decades following the end of World War I, countless local women, who would come to be known as the Angel Makers of Negarev, availed themselves of her lethal services. When the police finally caught on and came to arrest her, Fezkas committed suicide with one of her own potions. Eventually, in a case that gained worldwide notoriety, 34 peasant women ranging in age from 44 to 71 were put on trial for murdering relatives with Fezka's poison. 18 were convicted, 8 executed, and the rest acquitted. Dorothy Puente? Puente. I don't fucking know. Born in Mexico, Puente was abandoned as an infant and raised in an orphanage. Over the next 40 years, she married 4 times and gave birth to a daughter whom she immediately put up for adoption. In 1983, at the age of 53, she was sent to prison for drugging old men and stealing their money. Released in 1985, she rented a rundown house in Sacramento, California, and opened a rooming house for elderly persons on fixed incomes. Over the next 2 years, more than a dozen of her boarders disappeared. In November 1988, investigating neighborhood complaints about the stench emanating from Puente's property, police found the first of 7 corpses on her premises. Puente took flight, though she was eventually arrested in Los Angeles. She was charged with 9 counts of murder, although authorities believed her victims totaled 25. After a marathon 6-month trial, she was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Eileen Wuornos, commonly, if mistakenly, called America's first woman serial killer, Wuornos had the kind of upbringing that is almost guaranteed to produce a psychopathic criminal. Her father was a habitual pedophile who eventually hanged himself after being arrested for molesting a 7-year-old girl. At 6 months of age, Eileen was abandoned by her mother and left in the care of her grandparents. Her violent, alcoholic grandfather constantly threatened to kill her. He threw her out of the house when Eileen gave birth to an illegitimate child after being raped. She was 14 years old. From then on, she became a drifter, selling her body for drinks, drugs, and food. At 20, she married a 70-year-old man, a union that lasted all of a month. 2 years later, she attempted suicide by shooting herself in the stomach. Upon recuperating, she robbed a convenience store and spent slightly more than a year in prison. Her rage against the world, and particularly against men, reached a lethal pitch in late 1989 when she shot to death a male motorist who had picked her up at a Florida truck stop and driven her to a remote rooted area for sex. 6 more nearly identical murders followed over the next year. Eventually, Wuornos was arrested in a biker bar. She claimed self-defense for all 7 murders. At her 1992 trial, her lesbian lover, turned state's evidence and testified against her. Oranos was convicted and sentenced to death. 10 years later, in October 2002, the sentence was finally carried out. Oh, God. Black and white. This is going to be controversial as fuck. Though the great majority of American serial killers are white, there is no racial or ethnic basis for this fact. That is to say, there's nothing white or black, or for that matter, Asian or Hispanic or anything else about serial murder. Serial murder is a human phenomenon found throughout history and in virtually every culture, with the possible exception of the Inuits. Well, maybe it won't be so bad. Actually, one serial killer, William Tall, was an Eskimo by birth, but he committed his homicides in Texas and California, earning a spot on the FBI's most wanted list in 1965. The preponderance of white serial killers in our own country is simply a matter of demographics. In point of fact, as the New York Times reported in an article on October 28, 2002, black serial killers occur in roughly equal or even slightly greater proportion to the number of blacks in the population. Damn it. According to recent studies, between 13 and 22% of the United States serial killers are African American. Why then are people so surprised to learn that a fair number of serial killers are black men? Unfortunately, the most likely explanation has to do with the lingering racial prejudice. Oh, God, okay, maybe it will be bad. Serial murders generally kill within their own race. White serial killers tend to prey on white victims, black on black, and the sad fact is that the white majority is not especially interested in crimes involving minority victims. As a result, these cases get relatively little media coverage. This is true not just of serial murder, but of other horrific crimes as well. When the pretty blonde Mormon girl Elizabeth Smart was abducted from her home in Salt Lake City in June 2002, for example, her picture ended up on the cover of Newsweek. By contrast, when a 40-year-old African-American girl, Denariah Finley of Orange, Texas, was abducted from home in Slade just what made her, the newspapers barely reported the story. That's sad. Indeed, some white serial killers have deliberately exploited this sorry circumstance in order to avoid detection. Jeffrey Dahmer, for example, preyed mostly on African American and Asian young men, apparently in the belief that the police would pay less attention to the disappearance of minority victims, and in the 1920s, the hideously deranged child killer / cannibal Albert Fish snatched an untold number of black children from the streets of inner-city ghettos for the same reason. In short, one reason that most Americans haven't heard much about black serial killers is that throughout the decades, the police have been lax in pursuing them and the media uninterested in reporting on them, so long, that is, as the victims were also black. That's sad. Jarvis Coteau. It is significant that one of the most notorious African-American serial killers of the mid-20th century, Jarvis Coteau, only got caught after he began to target white women. In March 1941, a 25-year-old newlywed named Rose Abramowitz approached Coteau, who was loitering outside her Washington, D.C. apartment building. Abramowitz hired him to wax the linoleum floor of her kitchen. Once inside her home, Coteau strangled and raped her, then made off with $20. A few months later, 23-year-old Elizabeth Strife got into his car during a rainstorm, mistaking it for a taxi. Driving her to a nearby garage, Cato raped and strangled her, then dumped her nude body in another garage a short distance away. His final victim, also Caucasian, was a 26-year-old Bronx waitress named Evelyn Anderson. A watch belonging to Anderson was recovered from a New York City pawn shop and traced back to Cato. In custody, he confessed to having strangled 10 women with his bare hands and raped at least 4 others during the preceding 3 years. The majority of his victims had been, as the newspapers put it, I'm not saying that, they were black. A fact that undoubtedly accounted for the initially lethargic response of the police in pursuing the culprit. Convicted of the Abramowitz murder, Cato was sentenced to death and electrocuted on January 13th, 1943. I'm gonna end this here. We've read forever. Okay, that's enough for today. Oh my god. Alright. I will see you guys in the next episode. Bye.